If you've ever finished uni or a trade and thought, why did no one prepare me for this? This podcast is for you. And if you're a parent, a leader, or someone working with Gen Z, and you're genuinely trying to understand how they see work, life, and the future, this podcast is for you too. Welcome to Major in Adulting. Major in Adulting is about the space between study and real life. The part no one really explains, the expectations, the pressure, the confusion, and the conversations that don't usually happen across generations. I'm Romaine. I'm a mum of 4 young Gen Z adults, and I've spent more than 2 decades working in change, helping people and organisations move from where they are to where they need to be. And what I've learned, both at work and at home, is that real change doesn't come from telling people what to do, it comes from listening, from understanding different perspectives, and sometimes by putting yourself in someone else's shoes. That's exactly what this podcast is about. Now, this podcast didn't start as a big plan. It started in my home with my kids. Over the past couple of years, I've watched them step into that next phase of their adulting life, finishing uni for my kids, applying for jobs, trying to work out how they turn study, casual work, and life experience into something that looks like a career. And like a lot of parents, I have found myself helping with resumes, with interviews, and with general confidence. No, not doing their resumes and not sitting in their interviews, coaching them so that they can independently do them themselves. And a lot of the time, they'd say things like, I don't really have any experience that's worth talking about. And I'd say, well, let's just unpack that for a bit. So we talk about their casual jobs, their uni projects, volunteering, hobbies, and the personal growth that comes from navigating study and life at the same time that sometimes we all take for granted. One of them said, I just work in hospo, aka hospitality. And I said, okay, but what you actually did was deal with customers, solve problems under pressure, and show up consistently in a fast-paced environment. Now, that perspective didn't come from just guessing. It's come from years of me hiring people, building teams, reviewing resumes, running interviews, and from personally applying for roles and navigating change throughout my own career. And you could see it then, that moment where they realised, oh, maybe I do have something to offer. Watching that was a bit of a turning point for me because it took me straight back to when I finished uni. When I finished uni as a Gen Xer a few decades ago, I had no real support, no guide, no one explaining how to structure a resume or how to approach the job market. Back then, it was newspapers, circling ads, sending applications in an envelope, waiting, and often hearing nothing back in my case. I also needed 12 months of work experience before I could formally graduate, so it felt like a bit of a double hit. I was out of work, as in full-time professional work, for close to a year before I landed my first role. When I did, it felt like being thrown in the deep end. You just jumped in and hoped it worked out. I was grateful. I worked hard and I got promoted within 9 months. And from then, I've just kept saying yes to opportunities as they come. That mindset has shaped my career. At first, Major in Adulting was just an idea, something I'd mention casually at work, in conversations with younger team members, with friends, at the gym, with anyone who would listen. Every time I talked about it, people would say, that's a great idea. And yeah, while I didn't know whether they were just being polite, the idea didn't go away. I didn't have the time or space to act on it straight away, and so it sat there quietly until late last year, when I stepped away from corporate work and finally had the space to create something intentionally. The first people I checked in with were, my kids. And as anyone with adult children knows, they're often your biggest critics. I joked that I'll probably have 5 listeners, and I probably will. And they said, "Mum, who cares? If this is something you want to do, just do it." That stuck with me because this was never about numbers. It is about a conversation I have felt drawn to have. As I started talking more deliberately with Gen Zs, not just my kids, but their friends and friends of friends, something became very clear. Firstly, they gave me their time. And Gen Zs don't give their time unless they believe in the purpose. They opened up, they were thoughtful. They talked about work, yes, but also about purpose, well-being, pressure, and how they see the future unfolding. Things like housing affordability, financial insecurity, and a sense that the rules they were told to follow don't quite exist anymore. They'd say things like, "You should talk to my friend. This is a conversation that needs to be had." That was a real light bulb moment because Gen Z are already having these conversations, but mostly with each other, not with older generations and rarely with a Gen Xer who's actually listening to understand. What surprised me most was this. You would think that as a parent of Gen Zs, I'd already know all of this. But I didn't. And once I took my parent hat off, stopped trying to protect, advise, or fix, or just get on with it, I heard something different. I wasn't just hearing my kids, I was actually hearing a generation. And just to put this into context, because I do get asked this a lot, when I talk about Gen Z, I'm referring to people born roughly between 1997 and 2012. So today they're in their teens through to their late 20s. They're students, apprentices, graduates, early career professionals, and in many cases, they're already leading in their own way. They're not kids anymore, although I keep referring to them as kids, my kids. They're already part of our workplaces and communities, and this matters. Fun fact, by 2030, Gen Z are expected to make up around 30% of the workforce. So these conversations aren't about some distant future. They're about what's already happening now. And I think this part matters too. Because Gen Z didn't just arrive out of nowhere. They've been shaped by us, by how they were parented, by the schools we chose for them, by the expectations we set, and sometimes the pressures that we apply. They've grown up in a fully digital world with constant information, constant comparison, and sometimes very little separation between who they are and how they're perceived. So when we talk about Gen Z, how they think, how they behave, how they show up, we're also talking about the systems and environments they were raised in. In many ways, they're a reflection of the world that we created around them. Gen X, my generation, we grew up being told to just get on with it, don't complain, and be grateful to have a job. In other words, suck it up, eat shit, and get on with it. That mindset built resilience, somewhat, but it's also built silence. Between those two worlds, there's tension, but I have seen great opportunity through the conversations that I'm having. Majoring in adulting is about driving understanding across generations. It's about work and it's about life. Because the only way we start to understand each other and face what's coming is by actually listening. By taking the time to understand how people think, how they behave, what they believe, and what they're feeling, that's where true understanding starts. So that's how this podcast began, with my kids, with a lot of conversations, and with a realization that the gap between generation perhaps doesn't need more opinions, but maybe it needs more listening. If you're a Gen Z and you're trying to work out your next step, this podcast is for you. If you're a millennial, a Gen X, or a boomer, trying to understand the world your Gen Xers, colleagues, or teams are stepping into, this podcast is for you too. And if you're somewhere in between, still learning, still adjusting, still figuring it out, you'll find yourself in these conversations as well. This podcast isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking better questions and being open to hearing perspectives that might be different from our own. You might be surprised by what you learn. I definitely have been. You can find Major in Adulting on your favourite podcast platform. New episodes drop weekly, so subscribe if you want to keep the conversation going. And if you think someone else would get value from it, a friend, a colleague, your Gen Zs, your team, please share it with them. That's how these conversations grow. Till next time, keep majoring in adulting.